Hello and welcome back to the YouTube channel of Bethel Evangelical Free Church Hanley. This is another video in the series on Derbyshire churches, and this is the the Methodist chapel at Tissington. This chapel was built in 1933, not long after Methodist Union, which was when it was 1932, when the Primitive Methodists, the Wesleyan Methodists, and the United Methodists all came together to form the modern Methodist Church. There had been a Primitive Methodist Church here in Tissington since the 1860s. 1866, a chapel was built on this piece of land, and the reason it was built here, and one reason why I'm doing this video, is that the Fitzherberts, who we've seen earlier, their graves, their memorials at the parish church, St Mary's, and they were adamant, we will not allow a Methodist chapel to be built on our land. Some of their tenants, some of their farmers were Primitive Methodists, and they held meetings in their cottages, but even then there was a certain amount of pressure from the landlord, from the big house. No, you have to be Anglican. Well, there was a family named Johnson in the village who owned their own land, and this stands on one part of what was the Johnson family land. They built a chapel, originally a wooden structure with a corrugated iron roof. It was later replaced by a stone building, and then this building was built in 1933. The old building has been getting, shall we say, a bit rickety, and they felt the need for a replacement. Well, this is obviously going to be only a short video. It's only a tiny little building. But it's important to emphasise that the free churches are important in village life. Unfortunately, most of the village free churches around here, the Methodist chapels, have closed. The one at Parwich, the chapel is closed, it's rotting away quietly. The Methodists hold their services in a side chapel in the village church. There are other places, Alstonfield, Longnaw, where again village chapels are closed. So this is a good example. It's one of the few surviving village chapels here, and it's a good example and a good place to talk about village Methodism, the village free church. The parish church in a place like this would be dominated by the big house family. The vicar would be appointed by the big house family. He might even be a member of the big house family. The Church of England in villages like this was strictly hierarchical. It was less so in other villages, little villages where you didn't have a big squire, but here it would be strictly hierarchical. Where you sat in church would have been governed at the beginning of the 19th century by what your position was. And if you were just one of the ordinary folk, you were expected to defer to your quote-unquote betters. Methodism, particularly Primitive Methodism, was much more democratic. The Primitive Methodists, indeed, were accused of having a sort of lay tyranny, that the local people who ran the chapel, they had the power in the circuit. Now, Methodism in England, and I know some people watching this will be from other countries, Methodism in England divides in the 19th century. And it does so. John Wesley stays in the Church of England until his death. But at the end of the 19th, the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, Wesleyan Methodism becomes an independent church, a separate church, and it is Presbyterian in government. That is to say, it is the preachers, the ministers, who have the power, who govern the church. And there are many situations where local folk, particularly outside of the big villages, or the big towns and the big important chapels, the local people feel, the ordinary folk, working class people and the lower middle class feel that they are being excluded, that the ordinary people are being excluded. And so the Primitive Methodists, the name doesn't have anything to do with their buildings being a little bit on the primitive side, or anything to do with their worship. What it means is, what they're saying is, we're getting back to what Methodism was meant to be. So they are Primitive Methodists, and their main founders are, well, they are found in fact in Stoke-on-Trent, in the potteries. It all begins with a man called Hugh Bourne and another man called William Clews. And William Clews is related to the Wedgwoods. He's a potter. Hugh Bourne is another local man, and he comes from a farming background. And he is converted, and William Clews is converted. William Clews was quite a tearaway in his youth. And they begin to preach. They become local preachers with the Methodists, because Methodists have not just the ministers, but they have local preachers who are local men who are approved to preach. They're men who can preach. And Clews and Bourne have their own ideas about what we need to do. We need to hold big meetings and this sort of thing. And these then butting heads with the local Methodist leaders, the ministers, the stewards, etc., the big folk. The big folk are trying to be more respectable. And this leads eventually to a breach, and the Primitive Methodists are founded, and they have this great emphasis on the power of the ordinary folk. It's a much more democratic form of Methodism. So we'll have a look around this little chapel, and I'll make some comments on chapels. It's obviously it's 1930s. It's a building that's been recently reordered. It's only got a few of the old pews left. But it's important to emphasise that village Methodism was a great thing. It's not anymore, sadly. One of the things is villages now, people tend to work in the towns, but it's good to see a village chapel here. So let's have a look around. Now, when it comes to Methodism, I must confess a certain personal interest in Primitive Methodism, because my family were Primitive Methodists. The Charmleys, our particular branch, were Primitive Methodists in Chester, connected with the George Street Society. In fact, at one point, quite a lot of the family lived in the George Street area. This is post-Methodist Union. The Methodists have all come together now. Originally the roof here would have been open. It's now got a ceiling. This helps to keep the heat in. You'll notice the big windows. This is 1930s. It's quite a utilitarian building. In that sense, I think it reflects Primitive Methodism. There would originally have been a central pulpit here, but that's gone now. There's just this side lectern stroke pulpit, and then you've got the communion table that would be brought forward at communion, and underneath it is the font, which is this tiny little thing made of alabaster that would be brought out for baptisms. Of course, the Methodists are, well, they baptise infants. You'll see out the window there, lovely view, and you can just see the lumpy bumpy field there. That is a medieval field system. Today this is all sheep farming country, but before the Black Death this would have been very much arable farming, that in between those ridges, see the ridges, and you've got the furrow in between, and in between that would have been ploughed, and these strips of land would have been worked by the local folk here. But then with the Black Death, the population goes down. That would have been the vestry, that's now the kitchen toilets. The population goes down. And it's these common people who build these chapels. There's a place where they can get together, away from the squire, away from the hierarchy, away from the people who normally govern them, and they can govern themselves. They govern their own chapel. The Primitive Methodists had a great emphasis on local preachers, and the local preachers are local men who travel around the village chapels, and there were quite a number of Primitive Methodist chapels around here. And they would preach. You see at the back, you've still got a couple of the pews, but mostly it's chairs. Now, there are some people have a really big thing on pews. The reality is that any kind of seating that works is good seating. If it doesn't, then it's bad seating. The building here has been, as I say, massively reordered. It's not a terribly historic structure. 1933. It's still less than 100 years old. It's still less than 90 years old. Not a lot more I can say other than, very typically of these chapels, it's 4 walls and a roof. So we'll go outside and just have a little look around, and then I'll say some, well, then I'll close the video after that. But we progress to the door, because it's important, I think, to do that. And you've got a little porch out here, so let's go and have a look around the outside. So here we are outside at Tissington Methodist, and I've been saying 1933 going around. I misread the stone. It actually says 1955. This is very recent. The 1950s, immediate post-war, you're in this period when Britain is recovering, and some of these old buildings, they say, well, can we rebuild something that's more modern? There's a certain remaining confidence. Now that confidence sadly then ebbs away for various reasons, but the 1950s is a period of a certain amount of rebuilding post-war. It's a tiny building, it's on a tiny little site, but we can have a look around. There's a little car park we can wander into, so let's have a look around. So here we go, and yes, the thing is, it's such a simple style, you can't really tell whether it's 1930s, 1950s, and there's some lichen on the date stone that makes it look like it's 1933. It's actually 1955. My mistake. And a simple stone building, these big windows, just to fill it with light, and you've got your vestry sticking out there. You can see where there used to be a vestry door, and that's been blocked in because there's a toilet in there now. But when first built, there wouldn't have been something like that. So there we have it, Tissington Methodist Chapel. 1950 is a free church. And the village free church has contributed so much to Britain, and sadly now more and more they are disappearing, closing down. But this one is still there, and we pray that because here is the route. Here's where revival may well start, with these little old churches. So just say a few words, and so there we have it, Tissington Methodist.